Welcome, my friends, to another amazing YouTube presentation with yours truly, the NU Digital Classroom, which is you, right? I just make the videos. You're the class, and it's like, I don't know. It's been a joy doing this, and this is sort of the conclusion of the course. This is sort of the conclusion. I should have adjusted the angle of that. It is super angled. This is sort of the conclusion of the course in terms of the textbook. There's still a couple presentations I'm going to do that are, well, like the Dreams one and Ion, that I just think are kind of cool additional pieces of content. But this is the kind of completion of the textbook, right? This is chapter 13 and the completion of the life cycle, obviously. And some of the topics today are going to be kind of tough, but I'm going to try to do this in a variety of different ways. And this is a kind of different presentation because I'm like recording this on, it's like whatever, 11 o'clock on Tuesday of whatever week I'm going to post this, right? Like I'm recording this right now, but like you'll notice a couple components because the first time I made this presentation was actually last year. And you may have noticed, so with a lot of my presentations this year, I've used kind of like tweaked, updated versions of the PowerPoints, and then I've recorded everything new. The only presentation that wasn't new, I told you, was Iron and Silk. And so, but with this one, there's a couple situations where, oh yeah, I kind of did it once. If you saw that one where I read my grandpa's poem, that was another example of where I used something a bit pre-recorded. So I have a couple of those in here. Like I read a letter from Freud's grandma. I mean, not from Freud's grandma. Sorry, I have no idea why I said that. From Freud about his daughter, and then from Freud's grandma. That's such a weird sentence to come out. And then, oh yeah, and then the other one's about existential psychology, which is pretty interesting. So there's kind of two times where I read something, and when I was looking over the file and like getting ready to do this recording, I was like, I don't know, because in both those readings of those articles, I kind of get intense and into it, and I was like, I don't know, it feels almost like a bit fake and inauthentic to try to recreate that, and I thought it'd be kind of cooler to just pull those two pieces and then do like a fresh presentation around it. So I hope you find that cool, and let's get into it. It's a difficult topic, but you know, I enjoy the company of you, and today we're going to look at this from a variety of perspectives, right? We're going to look at it as what death is, like very literally, and we're going to kind of start there and look at sort of like what clinical death is and what brain death is and stuff like that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we kind of understand it as culture, and then we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, how it almost makes sense in terms of this broader discussion of life. Let's get into it. Welcome. So one of the first things to talk about is this idea that we often use the word death to sort of mean, well, a variety of things, right? And it's complicated when we actually start to talk about it because we mean, like, obviously quite literally death when we're talking about things like clinical death and brain death and also social death. There's another concept we're going to talk about in that regard, or like what the experience of that passing is to the social world that's left behind. For most people, death happens in late adulthood. However, many younger individuals in difficult situations can have disease or die in accidents, and like a lot of developmental events, the timing and motive of a particular individual's death affects its meaning and its effect on others. And it's like, in some ways, that's the most brutal sentence in the course, right? It's like, obviously at a certain level, that like the timing and the manner of someone's passing shapes the effect on people. I'm just reading you a couple notes I have here. I have it now in PowerPoint and not to This is just a side note in in teleprompter mode, so it's supposed to make it look like more like I'm looking at you when I'm reading it. It's kind of cool. Okay, back to being serious. Sorry, but yeah, I think it is interesting because it's like when we're looking at this medically, we're distinguishing between terms like clinical death and brain death and social death. In the industrial world, death often occurs in the context of hospitalization in hospitals, and also things like hospices. So that's sort of looking at it as like a topic in kind of sociology too. By age 6 or 7, most children understand this idea that death is permanent, and that's actually like it's a tough thing, right? Like it's something I can kind of see my daughter even starting to struggle with at 5. Teens sometimes have distorted ideas about death, especially around things like their own mortality. Right? It's hard to think that things aren't going to be like they are forever. Many young adults see themselves as invulnerable to death. For middle-aged adults, the death of a loved one or often a parent signals a change in social roles. Among middle-aged, fear of death is common. Older adults fear death less, especially those who are religious. This is going to be an interesting thing that we'll talk about today. It doesn't seem to matter the religion as much as the participation. Preparation for death may include practical activities such as things like writing a will. Many dying adults also prepare by sharing life experiences with younger family members. So what I'm kind of doing here, this is obviously kind of just like an intro, but I want to kind of make this point that we're going to look today at, or I'm going to at least hopefully try to look at this kind of holistically, and also not just as like a school topic, but as something that we're all have and will deal with. Some dying adults exhibit dramatic changes in cognitive and personal functioning just prior to death. This phenomena that's called terminal drop. Terminal drop. It's like a really far drop. Terminal. It's a difficult termination, terminal. You can see how those are the same root words. I'm just gonna go a little bit more on this intro, right? Like I'm doing kind of a preview, so don't be scrambling to take notes or anything. We're gonna talk a little bit about Kubler-Ross and her stages, and I want to maybe hit it from a slightly different angle than you've been exposed to, hopefully. Because her research suggests that not all dying individuals go through these specific stages. Like these are kind of, and that's true with every stage model in psych, right? Like that's kind of in some ways a lazy critique that like a stage model, whether it's Erikson or Freud or Piaget or Kubler-Ross, if people are like, well, some people do it earlier or later, it's like that's kind of like obvious, right? Like it's like, yeah, there's individual differences that defy definition, but that doesn't deny the fact that the model still on average predicts like maybe 96% of people or something. Research suggests that not all dying people go through the exact same stages, and critics of Kubler-Ross suggest that her stages may be too culturally specific, and that the process of it, which might be the case, so that would demand, that doesn't necessarily mean she's wrong, that just maybe demands an additional layer, right? Like maybe it needs to be well, it's just an interesting critique, because like obviously everything that's developed is developed where it's developed, and not necessarily 100%. I guess it's just a critique that it's not as universal as it might claim. Yeah, it's interesting to kind of break down what those critiques are really saying, because at a certain point that's always obvious, right? Like it's always obvious that a study you do over here isn't necessarily going to be the exact same over here. Attitude appears to affect the terminally ill individual's longevity. Those who have a fighting spirit tend to survive longer than their peers resigned to the inevitability of death, which, in an interesting connection, is sort of exactly what Frankl says in his idea of logotherapy. Okay, I'm almost done here. I just have a couple more points. I know this is like a 6-minute second slide, which is kind of brutal, but I'm just gonna give it again. This is like the 5th time on this slide. I can't restart it. It's almost 7. It's like over 6 minutes. So sorry I went like this and went the whole overall thing like a million times. But psychoanalytic theory emphasizes the traumatic nature of grief and the defense mechanisms that often accompany the experience. So we're going to talk about that, and we'll talk about attachment theory too, and how it suggests that grieving involves this series of stages, which is actually a really super deep idea, because you might think, how is attachment related to death? And the idea is it's actually a psychological detachment. Alternative approaches emphasize the individual nature of grieving. And I'm going to play a video from a woman today that's about the concept of complicated grief. And I think it's a really important notion, or developing area of research. I'm also going to talk a bit about things like funerals and other rituals that redefine the roles of the bereaved, and like how what is it meant for people that have lost a loved one and maybe not been able to have a proper sending off because of, well, for whatever reason, but especially in the last few years. What's the psychological cost of that? Right, like on families, on the ones left behind. And we know that things like grief, and I'm just going to keep going with this note, I'm at the very last point, that grief responses depend on the age and the mode of death. Right, which again, mode of death, that's like such a cold way of saying it, but it's like, that kind of makes sense, right? Like, it's like if you hear that somebody's really old grandma passes who was kind of sick, and again, it's like, my grandma passed, she was old and kind of sick, and it was still devastating. So I'm not like trying to say that that's not a bad thing, but it's like, compared to say like a child or something, it's, again, it's impossible to rate like what's worse. Or it's not impossible, I just mean, it's like, that's not what I'm trying to do, right? Because my very next sentence says losing a spouse also appears to be connected with some of the most intense grief responses, which makes complete sense. The health of widows and widowers decline in the first year following a spousal loss. And the effect is greater on widowers. Right? This one, men. Alright, my friends. That was a super long intro and a lot of points that weren't on the slide, and I apologize a bit for that, but like, I think that if you followed me through that rant, like, you kind of get the vibe of what I'm going to go at today. And let's keep it rolling. So earlier I had made this point of like the terms clinical death and brain death and social death. So here are some pretty good definitions. So clinical death being this period during which vital signs are absent, but resuscitation is still possible. Clinically dead. You sometimes hear that on like TV and stuff. Right, but so clinically dead, it's still theoretically possible you could be brought back to life. Right, like if you were all of a sudden like a medical team showed up with all the proper equipment. And see that I have the sub point, right? Presumably this is when near-death experiences occur. I have a story I'll tell sometime. Before I started this slide, I made the mental point to like try to, because on that last slide I rambled huge, to like try to be concise, and then I almost started going on a huge story about near-death experiences, but so I find that idea interesting too. So brain death, the next point there, that this is more obviously cognitively focused, right? So this is looking at like brain activity in the absence of that. At this point, we're seeing like, okay, basically the vital signs are down. So vital signs being basically like heart rate and breathing, the two absolute critical ones. And then no brain activity. So when we have kind of this combination of the clinical death, or basically like, and again, this kind of gets to an interesting point that it's like, well, what keeps you alive? It really always comes down to the same three things. And you see it here in a couple different ways, and just they're talking about it differently, right? It's basically your lungs, your heart, and your brain. Your breathing, your heart rate, and your cognitive functioning. And when those three things are done, the person's considered legally dead. And then this is like, I know I'm trying to not be like super emotional at every point, but I'm also trying to not be like too light about this, because it is such a tough thing, because it's this idea of then like the body sort of becomes a dead person. And this is this like heavy term, social death, which like sounds like not that heavy, but it's actually this like really complicated thing where the friend or the family member or whatever you gotta think like, what are funerals and where did they come from, and like why do like it seems like every group of people throughout the deep past of humanity have burial rituals, and like, and the point is that there's a psychological aspect to that. Nothing happened. My wife just came into the room to ask me something, so I just had to randomly on the fly there test the PowerPoint pause function while recording a slide. So I don't know if that worked or if it was a little bit hiccupy, but apologize, but we're a good 4 minutes into this, so I wanted to keep that discussion of these three different things. So let's move on to the next one. I hope that wasn't hope that was a smooth slide. Cheers, my friends. I don't know why I'm saying that like it's the end. We're only on slide 3. So yeah, think about this for a sec. I'll just hit so and just let it sit for 5 seconds. That's a brutal start. Let's just start over this slide, but I wanted to make this point. 200 years ago, almost 1 out of every 2 kids died before the age of 10. Think of how devastating that stat is. And 1 parent died before a child would grow up. Let me read that again. 200 years ago, almost 1 of every 2 child died before the age of 10, and 1 parent would have died before the child was fully grown up. According to Statistics Canada, a century later, in the early 20th century, about 1 in 10 Canadian babies died either at birth or in the first year of life. More recent statistics contrast sharply. In 2011, it was only 1 in 200. So think about that. In 200 years, this went from 1 out of 2 to 1 out of 200. Children died in the first year of life. Life expectancy has increased from 58.8 years for a man born in 1922 to 79.3 years now, and from 60.6 years to 83.6 years for women. The combined effect of things like child immunizations, increased health awareness, sanitation, healthcare, workplace safety is a huge one, and other practices such as things like safety belts or seatbelts have led to this, says Statistics Canada. And a devastating Canadian fact is that on average, Aboriginals in Canada live on average 5 years less. That's a stat from the Conference Board of Canada 2018. So there's obviously, depending on different cultures treat death very differently. There's huge cultural variations in how cultures deal with death and attitudes towards it. And it's kind of interesting, like this idea of like individuals being more conscious of their mortality during times of war and times of famine or food shortages or in times of plague. And that sort of makes sense. It's like when you're sick or when you're under extreme stress, you become all of a sudden more conscious of some of those, well, of your mortality. For some, death means loneliness in this ending, and then this is a weird point that for some people death is a quest for happiness, and it's like it doesn't really make sense. But I can tell the story of like my grandma, and I can remember when my grandma was about to die. She had a very strong belief system that like when she would pass on, that there would be that her brother and other family members were waiting for her, and she was almost excited, not in an accepting way. In most societies, and this is an interesting point to deal with, right? And it's like it's one of these weird things where we, like, as a society, act very secular in so many ways, but then still sort of act religious in this one way, and I mean kind of at a broad society level. You know, in most societies, death isn't viewed as the end of existence. It's like, what does that mean? That, like, just that sentence implies like some type of religion or some kind of what would traditionally be referred to as religious way of talking about it. How would death not be the end of existence? How, right? And to answer that question, you're probably going to bring up something like a soul or a spirit or an essence or an energy or all these things that are going to start to sound pretty religious. So I just want to take a quick second on this slide to talk about this idea that over the lifespan, how we view death is very different. And as an adult, we understand that death's irreversible, that it's final, and that it has this, like, it comes to everyone, and it means the kind of end or the ceasing of all functioning, like mainly, like as we were mentioning earlier, respiratory and brain and cardio and lungs or respiratory heart. Right, children, teenagers, and adults differ in their understanding of these aspects of death, and it's like so. My daughter's fish died a few days ago, maybe a week ago now. So we did like a little. She wanted to say a few words, and we gave it the royal flush down the toilet, and then when she was laying in bed, I was like laying with her, rubbing her back, and she was just kind of upset, and she was like, "How come we flushed it down the toilet?" And I was like, "I don't know. That's just like I had a fish when I was little, and it died, and that's what my dad did." And she was just like, just give me this like big hug, and like, I don't know. It's just there's a ritual. See, one of the points I want to make today is how much that ritual is a part of the healing and the making sense of it, and the making sense of the ritual is almost like an attempt of the human mind to try to, or over time, make sense of something that you can't make sense of. How do we make sense of questions of existence and of what happens after death, and these questions that are almost just intrinsically unknowable? Right, in relation to what I just said, that like we all know as adults, it's like that's sort of almost definitional of how an adult's understanding is different than a child's understanding, especially like a young child. A young child often doesn't make that connection that death's irreversible and that it comes to everybody and that it's the end of everything, right? It's not just like your player dies on the level of the video game you're on and you respawn at the same place. It's like there's a finite nature. And I like this point that like the more that you kind of teach your kids about nature and about biology and stuff like that, it gives you a way to talk about it. And by school age, most children seem to understand both the kind of permanence and the universality of death, that it's something that happens to everyone and it has this permanence. An adolescent understands the finality of death better than children do. In an abstract sense, they understand it's inevitable. But there's kind of this interesting point, right? That they just think of yourself, even like some of you I understand, or maybe even you're probably not still teenagers. I guess if you went straight from high school and you're in your second year, you could be 19 or maybe even 18. I'm not really sure. But anyways, like I'm sure a bunch of you were at least recently that. And so again, you have to take this with kind of what's it saying. It's not saying like, oh, you just didn't know this, but what it's saying is like, yeah, it's you knew it, but there's almost like, yeah, it's almost like there's a difference between being aware of something and having like a practical understanding of how it might affect you. And that one of the things that's sort of characteristic of adolescence is this idea of the personal fable, or this like my life is a movie idea, right? And it's like, and it's not critiquing adolescence. It's like, it's not, I'm not like trying to say like, oh, that was you but not me. It's like that's kind of characteristic for that stage, is this. And it's because we're becoming so self-aware, and it's kind of this, and because of puberty and because of all kinds of physiological and emotional and cognitive changes that are happening, and we're very focused on our own kind of subjective hypothetical life story created by ourselves. And that personal fable can contribute to risky behavior and unrealistic beliefs about personal death that can in troubled situations turn into fantasies towards self-harm, which are as serious as things get. So this is I feel like at the beginning of every slide I've been saying like, so this is a tough one, and it is, because all these things are just moving from one tough topic to the next one. In early adulthood, sometimes the loss of a loved one appears to shake people's belief systems. Think how deep that actually is, right? And some of the belief system that it shakes is around like mortality and this idea of being invincible. All of a sudden, like somebody loses somebody that's close to them and realizes like sort of their own vulnerability, right? Yeah, and like in that second point, just the personal experience changes perceptions of death. It's like in a certain perspective that's like super obvious, right? Like obviously like your views of death and are largely shaped by your experiences of it, and sometimes it's our own experiences with exposure, right? And it's like people that are, for example, exposed to that like work in a funeral home or maybe work in healthcare settings will have developed a certain desensitivity to it. They, it's really important to support family members of lost loved ones, because the tendency towards suicidal thoughts is statistically higher in those groups, and that's like an important point to know. It's interesting because in the book it talks a bit about like um, specifically Princess Diana and JFK. Now, those two deaths were shocking, not just because they were young, right? Like, those were two very significant deaths. Princess Diana, maybe one of the most popular people in the world at the time, right? Like, literally the princess. and really there's a lot of political turmoil at the time, like her story. It's obviously super complicated, right? Married to Charles, but like, and then like nowhere near as complicated. Even like that's a complicated situation that has a lot of conspiracy around it and stuff. But the other one, JFK, like literally the president of the United States that got assassinated while president of the United States. And these things happen, and it's like, how do you make sense of it? But again, it's just kind of, I thought, I just mean it in, I'm not trying to make light of it, but just it was really interesting to me that the textbook chose those two as the examples, because you could have just said something like even just think when Kobe Bryant died last year, 2 years ago, that was shocking to the whole basketball world, and that's just a world I'm pretty conscious of because I love watching basketball, and it's like one of the reasons that was so shocking is because it was so early. It was like, you'll hear everyone say before his time, which they mean by that. It's like, it just doesn't make sense. Right? And people don't want to think that that's possible for themselves. So it says here, such early deaths challenge young people's beliefs in unique vulnerability and therefore provoke defensive reactions that can cause them to place those who die in a special category. These young people must then come in their own minds, kind of come up with reasons for why death came early to someone like JFK. Again, not the greatest example. Let's say like Kobe, but it will not easily happen. As a result, they may elevate the figures to near sainthood. So, and again, it's like, again, I didn't use the best examples like Diana and JFK, and even the Kobe Bryant situation are all complicated situations where it's like, basically the point is just that, well, it kind of is hard to explain when it's younger people. It's like, you all know what I mean. It's just a difficult point to articulate. Death changes the roles and relationships of everyone in the family, as well as people beyond the family. And the point here is sort of that death brings changes to whole families and whole kind of social systems. It's like in that third point, right? It's because that first part's kind of obvious, but it's like, just because it's sort of obvious doesn't mean it's not kind of devastating too, right? That like, well, now it's not like that just affects you for a while. Now that whole system is different. And many individuals, this is like saying like in middle age, like, so once people kind of hit that stage that I like, maybe 40, 50 or whatever, and start to realize that, they'll start looking at it, how much time they have left. And people do certainly do that. Now think of that last point, right? That like, middle-aged or older adults who continue to be preoccupied with the past are more likely to be fearful and anxious about death. And in relation to the thing that you were talking about, or that we've been talking about at other points with Erickson and like integrity and stuff, it's like interesting to note that people that score higher in despair, so like the flip of integrity, tend to be more fearful of death too. And the higher you score in, so then the reverse of that would be that the higher you score in integrity, the less fear of death. That's one factor, and but an even stronger variable is religious belief, and not necessarily, again, the type of religion, but just people that seem, and it makes sense, right? It's like if you have an idea of where you think you're going after and you believe that strongly, then that situation's maybe less scary. You know, the relationship of death and why religion is even a thing, sort of. Right? They're intimately, deeply connected topics. It's almost impossible to talk about, even in a psychology class, even in a class like this where I've tried to keep pretty kind of science-based and biology-based and developmental psych-based and evolution-based. It's hard not to sound super religious when you're talking about death, because it's almost one of the last things that as a society we still use very religious language about. So on the next slide is going to be one of those pieces of pre-recorded content I was talking about, where I'm going to review this article. So, and there's a few of you that are also taking my 4306 course and about positive psychology, and I talk about Paul Wong a bit. I don't think I reviewed this specific article, but a similar one, or I think I actually just used a few of his ideas. So this will be, I don't think, a direct repeat for you. But and that's only a few of you, but if it is, you can skip this part. But if you haven't heard of Paul Wong before, I would definitely write down these 6 things, right? Because Paul Wong, and the reason I made that little point before is because in my positive psychology course I spend a lot of time talking about Paul Wong, because I think that he's actually really interesting, because he bridges this gap between this field that's sort of this current big thing, positive psychology, and what I agree with his point that it actually gets a lot of its kind of theoretical weight and argument from existential, and we've made the point in the other course, kind of phenomenological and roots. So anyways, that was just a long-winded way of saying that this is like an interesting guy that has this idea that when we're looking at death, we need to look at it from this existential. So remember, existential would just mean issues of existence. What really matters, what happens after we die, is there a God? What is heaven? Is there heaven? These are all existential kind of questions, right? These are all questions that are, what this means is, think of how existential is basically the word existence. It's like existence level questions. What does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be a human being that doesn't exist forever? What does it mean to have the people in your life not exist forever? So anyways, that was just me ranting. So he said actually there's like 6, and the finality of death, right? That's such a devastating one, that it's just like not a video game that you respawn again and have a second life. The uncertainty of what follows, like not knowing about what happens after you die in the afterlife. Why so much religious focus is on that? And it's like, it's understandable. It's because it's an unanswered question. Annihilation anxiety, like that's an interesting term, right? That's like a word that I don't know if Wong made up, but it's understandable, right? You can understand what anxiety means, obviously, and then annihilation, meaning like the end, to be ended, non-existence, and that's like almost the ultimate loss. And then that's like, in a way, at a deep level, that's like the ultimate existential question, is like, what would non-existence even mean? The fear of pain and loss, and obviously it means like not existing, but it's like, it's almost impossible for the part of your mind that's your mind to contemplate not existing. So it's a wildly deep idea. The fear of failing to complete your life's work. All right. So this next slide's previously recorded content, and then we'll come back to the presentation, the live content, or whatever, 2022 content. Okay, so I got another article for you, but at this point, my daughter's home. She's downstairs watching Rapunzel, so I have a few minutes, and I was gonna add this later, but it's kind of a longer article, and it might work a little bit better if I pre-record this and add it as a video, and then hopefully get through it smoothly in one go. So I hope this works okay with me, like beside the video, but I brought the decent mic up, so hopefully it sounds okay. This is this Paul Wong that I had shown on the previous slide, the 6-piece model, and this is called Existential Positive Psychology. Okay, so posted by Paul Wong, 2015, Existential Psychology, Meaning Therapy, Positive Psychology, Writing. I guess those are just the tag words. So the abstract, let me go, I'll use the scroller. Existential psychology is about human existence and the human drama of survival and flourishing. It is inherently positive because it emphasizes the courage and responsibility of confronting existential anxieties and living an authentic life. Unfortunately, the popular existential literature tends to focus on the darker side of the human condition. Yeah, that's certainly true. Existential psychology can learn from positive psychology's scientific method and focus on the positive. So you're going to see the emergence in this article of this term, positive existential psychology, right? So you can see this is the combination of positive psychology principles and existential psychology. Positive psychology, PP, has now come full circle to its existential roots. Positive psychology is intrinsically existential because it is concerned with such fundamental questions about human existence as what is the good life? What makes life worth living? How can one find happiness? However, these existential questions cannot be fully addressed through positive psychology research alone without recognizing people's existential anxieties. Yeah, a maturing positive psychology needs a return to its existential humanist roots to rediscover the richness of lived experience and the many pathways to meaning in life. Right, so this article is pretty cool. So all these questions, right? So existential positive psychology, or EPP. So see how it's the combination of existential thought and positive psychology thought. So you see there it says one or the other, and all it does is switch the first, second word. Or positive existential psychology represents a natural combination between the two. Basically, EPP addresses a few fundamental questions about self-identity and the human condition of striving for happiness within the constraints of reality. Exactly. Who am I? What defines me? Who am I? Even when, I don't know if that came on the screen or not, that reminder. Anyways, who am I when everything is stripped away from me and I'm reduced to a naked, lonely soul? That's a tough question. Is there anything unique and special about me? How can I be happy? Why am I bored? Why am I so dissatisfied with my life? What is the good life? Is this all there is to life? These are existential questions. These are being listed as examples of existential questions. Right? How do I make the right choices? What should I do with my life? Where do I belong? Why do I feel so alone in this world? How can I develop a sense of meaning in my relationships and find acceptance? Where is home? What's the point of striving when life is so short? Why should I struggle to survive when life is transient and fragile? And what's the point of building something only to be swallowed by death? All these questions are related to the human processes of making sense and finding a purpose or a reason for existence. It is the spirit of asking tough questions and rejecting pre-packaged easy answers that characterizes existential psychology. Great point. EPP is open to insights, wisdoms, and facts of life from all sources, regardless of the paradigm of knowledge claims, thus providing a richer research agenda. In short, EPP broadens the definition of positive psychology as the study of ultimate concerns through integrating both positive and negative aspects of the human condition in order to create a better future for self and others. What qualifies EPP as positive psychology is its emphasis on the human capacity for positive growth and change. Change and growth. It's funny I said that backwards. Yalom. So Yalem's a really interesting person to look into too, Irvin Yalom. Really big name in group psychology. Yalom has already identified 4 existential anxieties: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. How we confront and resolve these existential givens is related to the courage and creativity we can muster. I've just added 2 more existential questions related to identity and happiness. These 6 issues are the recurrent themes of human existence, even if they remain unconscious or latent in some individuals. Yeah, so it's interesting. I might not read the whole thing because it's super long, but I want to read just this one piece, okay? So it kind of breaks down this is a cool article, but I just want to read this part from identity crisis to the quest for authenticity. Identity crisis is not limited to adolescence. It can be an ongoing struggle to define and redefine ourselves when we go through major life transitions and upheavals. The search for identity requires self-knowledge. The ancient Delphic injunction carved into the litanal at the temple of Apollo, know thyself, still resonates with the postmodern generations. Without a clear sense of self-knowledge, we can go through life without even knowing who we are and what we really want in life. The discomfort of identity crisis is necessary for initiating the quest for authenticity. However, defense mechanisms also often keep identity anxiety at bay, and social pressures of conformity and enculturation provides an easy escape for this existential quest. The dehumanization of a competitive capitalist society further narrows people's vision to material gains. As a result, people are confused about their true identity in the larger scheme of things. Thus, the quest for the authentic, or the quest for authenticity, remains a challenging and poignant task in a consumer culture. Yeah, exactly. I just want to read these next 2 paragraphs and then I'll finish this video. Okay, authenticity has been a recurrent theme in the existential literature. Heidegger differentiates between the non-authentic and the authentic mode of living. The non-authentic people give up their individuality and responsibility for the security of being part of the herd. In contrast, the authentic people assume responsibility to live in a way that's consistent with their true nature and core values. They strive to become what they were made to be, in spite of the anxiety and risk involved. There is no shortcuts to authenticity. Test scores on personality, vocational interests, and signature strengths can be helpful, but there's no passion in cold numbers, no inspiration in formulas. The process of authentication often begins with a moment of awakening, a deepening of conviction about core values, and a felt sense of one's true identity. If it is discovery of an inner vision about one's own uniqueness and singularity that endows life with deeper meaning. It's a well-written article. But this is just the start. The pathway to authenticity entails risks, setbacks, and sufferings, especially when it's contrary to social norms. In many instances, the quest for authenticity means persecution and death, because those who dare to march to a different drum and challenge the status quo are likely to be maligned, marginalized, even martyred. Thus, the quest for authenticity and meaning is not always compatible with the pursuit of happiness and a good life. To live an authentic and meaningful life means that one cannot deny one's true nature, and calling even if it means death. Jesus is case in point, so is Socrates. It's interesting that they say that. That's an interesting narrative addition there by the author. Both of them died for what they said. From an existential perspective, authentic happiness flows from the authentic mode of living. Quoting Alfred Camus's rhetorical question, but what is happiness except the simple harmony between a man and the life he leads? Equating happiness with harmony of living. According to Schumacher, this harmony can be achieved not just by doing what one is best at, but also by living like human beings who need social connection and spirituality. Yeah, so interesting. This is a pretty neat article. All right, so I'll let you read the rest of that. It's actually a super long article. I'm only on like point 1 of 6, so but now you kind of got the feel of it, and here's the link of it is in the presentation. See you back from downstairs in the main lab. So another interesting idea is how religious belief plays a factor, and I've actually hinted at this point a few times, but it's actually interesting that it seems to be the people that are really religious and the people that aren't religious at all that fear death the least. It seems to be the people that are unsure that fear death the most. And actually that makes sense. Because if you think about it, people that are completely not religious, they'll hate to hear me say this, and I don't mean it disrespectfully, it's really just a play of words, that's just a different religion. Right? It's a set of beliefs about religious topics, and the conclusion that those beliefs are is that they're not true, but it's still a set of beliefs that are just as belief level. It's interesting. It's like, and just as belief level, what I mean by that, and what am I trying to say here? It's like you having a belief that nothing happens in the afterlife, or you having a belief that something very specific happens in the afterlife, are completely different. But what's the same about them is that they're both specific ideas of what happens next, right? One is that you go to like maybe say like a Christian idea of heaven, and then the other is that you believe that like you become dust, and it's a very just biological understanding of it. But then people that don't know where they stand on that, it's the most anxiety provoking. The most fearful may be those who are uncertain or uncommitted to any religious or philosophical tradition. But remember this point, and this is kind of the point I was making before, is that like, okay, maybe you could actually make the idea that atheism or being agnostic, yeah, that'd be an interesting argument. Is that more of a religion or more of a philosophy? And again, at a certain point, like the difference between religion and philosophy is an interesting question too, right? And they're obviously different, but a lot of religious writing is very philosophical, and a lot of philosophical writing deals with topics that are very religious. So, and a lot of philosophers dealt with a lot of religion, a lot of religious people dealt with a lot of philosophical things. So, like the overlap of the traditions is massive. Religious belief may moderate, yeah, fears of death. Like may actually like think about it. It's like, and this kind of goes with Paul Wong's point about like death, there being the fear of death being anxiety provoking, and that like maybe having a way of understanding and contextualizing it within a religious framework can take some of that fear or anxiety away, especially if you're viewing it, as that point says, death as like a transition. And then there's this factor that also, like, as people get older, they tend to believe in God more. that seems to be cross-cultural and not religion-specific.
No matter how hard I try, I cannot recall what it was like being dead. I know that I was, but I have no idea what it was like. I was actually dead for a pretty long time too. Based on what I've been told, I was dead for between 13.7 and 13.8 billion years. Regardless of whether we want to admit it, we all fear death. The awareness of our impending mortality is one of, if not the most influencing force on our experience of life. The things we do, the thoughts we have, the feelings we experience. Everything is driven by both our unconscious nature to stay clear of death and our conscious awareness of the fact that at some point we will have to face it. Our bodies and minds are mere rentals gifted to us by the universe for a vacation of conscious physical existence, and at some point they must be returned. The place in which they return to, however, is the same place in which we received them from. Whatever that experience of no experience was before I was born, the 13.73 billion years of time, energy, and matter that I can't recall or describe, the thing that I manifested out of, and the thing that I would dissolve back into. I have already experienced it. You have already experienced it. We have all already experienced it. Even if you believe that your spirit, soul, energy, or whatever else you might call it is infinite, then its infiniteness must go both forward and back. If you believe in an afterlife, then in principle there must be a before life, because if you end up somewhere after physical conscious form, then you must have come from somewhere before physical conscious form. And if you argue that you must be born physically to access an afterlife, you are declaring that you must be a physical entity to access a non-physical thing, which completely folds in on itself. Arguably, no matter how hard we might try to paint a picture of something different after this life, there appears to be no way around the idea that in terms of personal experience, whatever came before our life is what will essentially come after. This means that you have been dead before. You know what it is like. To your conscious, subjective self, for lack of better terms, it is like absolutely nothing. This nothing is not the sort of nothing that we typically consider nothing to be. It is a nothing that we cannot describe, understand, or recall. A subsistence far beyond our consciousness and sense of self. Something that doesn't require either, and thus to our consciousness and sense of self, it is nothing. This nothing, however, is not scary. Before you were born, you were perfectly fine with this nothing, perhaps more fine than you can even fathom. Being dead is not scary. The conscious thought of dying without being at terms with it is scary. Naturally, coming to terms with our mortality is extremely difficult. We rarely ever discuss or address it at a level of self-honesty and vulnerability. It is rare that death, in any real sense, comes up in conversation, and it is rare that we ever deeply meditate on the fact that we will all die sometime in the relatively near future. However, it is essential that we do confront the thought of death regularly and honestly. By becoming deeply aware of our mortality, we intensify our experience of every aspect of life, writes author Robert Greene. No matter what we do to veil or distract ourselves away from the awareness of death, the awareness will continue to buzz inside of us. When we do not address and embrace the buzzing, it only becomes louder and more intrusive. It causes us to feel intensifying levels of anxiety, aversion, and disorientation. Instead, we must learn how to live with this buzzing and transmute it into the sound of life itself. We must accept death as an essential part of life. Doing things the second time around is almost always less intimidating than the first. So if we consider the idea that we have already experienced what it means to be dead and come to terms with the fact that we will experience it again and be totally and utterly okay, then death becomes easier to face, easier to reduce our fear and apprehension towards. To reduce our fear of death is to crack open the door to life itself. We become more inspired to do things that are interesting, exciting, and fulfilling, rather than being stuck in a cycle of wasting time, feeling anxious, and latching onto material distractions. At some point, we will lose our ability to experience things as we know them. Like it or not, that is the condition of our human experience. If we wish to make the most of our human experience, instead of living in spite of its conditions, we must accept them. Like a vacation to our favorite destination, we should not let our awareness of the trip's end date ruin our vacation. For if a vacation went on forever, it would no longer be a vacation at all. Against all odds, we were given the opportunity to go on this vacation, to experience nature perceiving itself. Ironically, our fear of losing our ability to experience this is what can ruin our ability to ever actually enjoy it, and we mustn't let this happen and squander such a gift. More than death itself, we should fear never overcoming the idea of death while we are alive. We should fear not appreciating life and death for what they are while we can. Thank you for watching. If you found enjoyment and value in this video, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you are not already, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We are constantly coming out with new videos to help you experience life with clarity and wonder.
So I know that that you're working on your Erickson paper, and it's like kind of interesting tie-in that like Erickson thought that so much of this final stage of life is going to be focused on integrity versus despair. And it's interesting how that relates with death, is that like people, and I had sort of mentioned this before, but adults who have accomplished goals or believe that they've become the person they set out to be have report less fear of death, which is like basically direct confirmation of Erickson's main idea here. This idea that purpose or meaning reduces fear of death. Frankl had a similar point. And it's not weird that there's similarities between Erickson and Frankl, who were both psychoanalysts. Yeah, so it's just a kind of direct connection to your project, is that like Erickson thought that this was actually huge. It's not just like a nice thing to develop integrity, it's actually huge. It helps you process the final stage of life. Thanatology. There's the word. There's our word for the day. It's an interesting word, right? Thanatos is ancient Greek, and just like a lot of words in psychology. And I was talking with someone about this a while ago, about how just like so many people, like someone like Freud or Jung, or a lot of these early people in the field that a lot of you are in, the early kind of founders of psychology, would have assumed that their audience had familiarity with the ancient Greeks, which is sort of interesting because like in our North American school system, we don't really spend much time on the classical literature as much as in the European school system at that time. So there's so many references to Greek mythology, and that's why picking up like Jung or Freud can be a little bit overwhelming, because they make so many references to other pieces of literature that if you haven't read, you have to kind of like do a lot of, even myself sometimes I'm like looking up what the book was about and stuff, and it's just that um, they were super well read in the classics. Thanatos' death. So the study of that, the scientific study of death and dying. So for this slide specifically, I'm just going to actually read it because it's kind of technical, that there's this kind of practical preparation that a lot of people go through when preparing for death. And this is obviously not in scenarios where someone dies unexpectedly or young, or unexpectedly. This is a scenario where maybe someone's like can see something coming, or is like in terms of they're sick for some reason, or a situation where someone's getting older, and it's like there's some practical consideration around things like life insurance and making a will, and preparations that are more common as people move towards later adulthood and more accepting of this idea of their own mortality. So that's like kind of at a very kind of daily to-do list level, right? Not to say that those things are little things, but those are like just practical things that people need to do. But then at a deeper level, people prepare for this end of life by this increasing of reminiscence, right? We talked about that in one of our presentations, where one of the recent ones, where I was kind of making this point that like that's probably one of the most definitional characteristics of that stage of life cognitively, is this tendency towards reflective self-thought. And then so the point, and this is tying back with Erickson again, is like then therefore the quality of that reminiscing is important, right? Because if that reminiscing is all bitter and resentful and revengeful, or resentful and despair full of despair, that's very different than if it's filled with gratitude and integrity. And deeper still, there may be unconscious changes that occur in the years just before death as a type of preparation. It's like, yeah, deeper still. That's a good way to start that sentence, because that's a very deep idea that maybe organism-wise, because like what would that imply? Right, that like deep in our kind of DNA substructure, or like it's saying like that there's like some signaling happening, in that like there's parts of our mind that are aware of that we're maybe not consciously aware of, and there's some kind of preparatory communication happening between the physiological system and the unconscious mind. And it's not like, I guess that doesn't happen in a ton of ways. It's just an interesting way of thinking about it. So in terms of the psychology of studying things like grief, and in a second I'm going to have a slide, I got a couple slides here on Ross, but then I'm going to be talking about, or have a psychologist that's doing a video, or that I'm including, talking about complicated grief and what specifically that is. I think that's an awesome term. But first, let's start with Ross. So Kubler-Ross is like probably the biggest name in this whole area of sort of the psychology of grief. Swiss-American psychiatrist. Right, and she kind of talked about this idea of like people going through stages. The late Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a Swiss-American psychiatrist who studied the experience of the dying and their loved ones. In the 60s, she formulated a model based on her interviews with approximately 200 adults who were all dying of cancer. In it, she asserted that those who are dying go through a series of psychological stages. So that's actually pretty interesting, right? To think that she developed these stages specifically through her interviews with people that were dying of cancer, and it was like approximately 200 people she interviewed. So with Kubler-Ross, she had this idea, and I'm just going to put all 5 points up, that there's these 5 stages, right? And I know you've probably heard of these, and so I'm going to kind of go over this sort of quick. That initially somebody, has a loss, and there's this kind of denial and isolation, like I want to be by myself, I want to kind of like, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to talk about it with, especially with random people. The person's sort of denying that this is happening to themselves, that well, it's so interesting, right? She's like almost presenting this as like a defense mechanism. It's like you're under this, because before I had made the comment that your mind, the thought of non-being is very Paul Wong is kind of Paul Wong's point, that that's existentially threatening, and so it makes sense that there's a tendency to deny that and to retreat to within oneself, and then to get mad at it when someone starts to realize, like, maybe all of a sudden they're denying a certain type of cancer, but then their symptoms and conditions are getting worse and worse and worse, and they're getting less and less able to kind of pretend like it's not the case, or whatever the situation is. The person recognizes the denial can no longer be maintained, and they get mad about it. Sorry, I just yawned a bit. I'm not bored with this presentation. I love doing this. It's just like 1 in the morning here. But I'm drinking tea. I still got lots of energy. That was just a random yawn. Sorry about that. I hope it didn't make you yawn too. That's interesting. That's an evolutionary signaling mechanism to let everybody else in the group know it's bedtime. It's interesting why seeing other people yawn makes you yawn. You don't have to be taught that. Okay. See how I explained my way my yawn with hopefully an interesting evolutionary psych fact. Stages are not fixed. I didn't finish my point. Okay, so people go through anger, and then her point was that then they move from anger to the stage of bargaining, right? Like almost bargaining with God, or bargaining with the nurses, or bargaining with family members. I can do this, and if I do this, then this will be okay. And you can see the desperation in that, and it's understandable. And then when people realize that they can't make a deal to get their way out of it, whether it's with God or, depending on the unique person's situation, that's associated with depression. And then a type of acceptance, right? And so Kubler-Ross's idea is that these are kind of stages that people go through, obviously, and initially she was focused a lot on the actual experience of the person that was dying, and then later she sort of expanded her work to look a little bit more at the grieving family members and stuff like that. From the psychoanalytic perspective, the death of a loved one is an emotional trauma. As with any trauma, the ego or mind tries to insulate itself from the unpleasant emotions that such loss induces through the use of defense mechanisms, including especially denial and repression. Freud believed that defense mechanisms, however, were only temporary devices for dealing with negative emotion. Eventually, the individual needs to examine the emotion and their source directly. Otherwise, such emotions lead to the development of physical symptoms and perhaps mental illness. I'll read that last part again because I stumbled it. Eventually, the individual must examine their emotion and their source directly. Otherwise, such emotions lead to the development of physical symptoms and perhaps mental illness. Freud's view has been very influential in grief counseling and in popular notions about the necessity of working through grief in order to avoid its long-term effects. Psychoanalytic-based grief therapy for children often emphasizes the use of defense mechanisms other than denial and repression to cope with grief. Examples are sublimation, expressing feelings through art, right? I have that there, but sublimation is an interesting idea. It's like having like these emotions that are too difficult to talk about in words, but expressing it through art is the perfect example of sublimation, finding an artistic expression for an idea too complex to articulate, rather than more negative defense mechanisms. Some therapists advocate encouraging children to use identification to manage grief by watching popular films depicting a child's grief. So that's interesting, right? It's like, you see how you're kind of like the kid in the movie, right? That's dealing with how their fish died. This is like the most simple example, right? If, say, my daughter's dealing with the fish that died, obviously there's more serious examples. The psychoanalytic perspective has shaped grief research by characterizing the loss of a loved one as a trauma. So, this is my link to Freud, because we're going to talk about him for a sec here. Although we know that after such a loss, the acute sense of mourning will subside, we also know that we shall remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what may fill the gap, even if it be filled completely, it nevertheless remains something else. And actually, that's how it should be. It's the only way of perpetuating that love which we do not want to relinquish. This is a Freud quote, and I thought that this was an awesome quote, and when I originally made this presentation, I included this quote, and then I kind of got thinking about where this quote specifically comes from. And, oh, I should add, this, yeah. I'm just doing this in presenter mode, and I can see that there's like other things I need to press before the next slide, so that's good because I would have forgot that. But yeah, I just had down here, this is a letter from Freud to this Ludwig Binswanger, who's a Swiss psychiatrist and actually an interestingly prominent person in existential psychology. And this is he's reflecting on his daughter's death to the Spanish flu. So I wanted to look into this quote. So I just wanted to take a second here and show you a picture of Freud with his daughter. In this article, I have linked here, if you download the PowerPoint and click on Jennifer Delgado. I was unfamiliar with her before today, but you'll see me, I have another one of these things where I did a screen share of me reviewing the article, and I just added the video straight into this, so it's just one big file. Hopefully that makes it a little bit smoother for all you students that I'm making this for, obviously, right? But anyways, the point I was going to just say there is, you'll notice it a couple times in the video on the slide coming up, I compliment the fact that Jennifer Delgado in this article does a fascinating job of presenting Freud. Maybe I should just say it like that. So I was looking into the backstory of a quote from Freud I wanted to use in a lecture that was talking about grief, and in a lecture talking about death, dying, and bereavement as an endpoint for a course on developmental psychology, and came across this article from Jennifer Delgado. I'm not sure if she works directly for Yahoo News, but this was from June 16th, 2020. But it's an awesome article, and I thought it was really interesting and powerful, and links together a lot of the things that we've been covering in the course, and it's just so relevant to developmental psychology and also to this current situation we're in. And this article is looking at when Freud lost his daughter to the Spanish flu. I have the article kind of pinched so that to cut out the ads, but it says on the side there a story that connects the past to the coronavirus, or to coronavirus. So the part of the subtitle you can't see just says a story that connects the past to the coronavirus. You see here a picture of Freud with his family. Yes, that caption, Sigmund Freud and his family in 1898. Sophie Freud is the little girl on the left when she was 5 years old. This afternoon, we received the news that our sweet Sophie in Hamburg had been snatched away by influenza, snatched away in the midst of glowing health from full and active life as a competent mother and loving wife, all in 4 or 5 days as though she had never existed. It is a distant voice that echoes our reality. It brings us face to face with our vulnerability and the terrifying possibility of losing loved ones. These are the words that Sigmund Freud wrote to Pastor Oskar Pfister in a letter dated 27 January 1920 to tell him that the so-called Spanish flu had snatched his daughter away from him. The devastating effect had the unexpected. Sophie was Freud's fifth daughter and probably his favorite. She softened her father's autocratic character, and as she grew up, she invoked feelings of admiration in him, according to his biographers. At the age of 20, Sophie Freud had married Max Halberstadt, a photographer from Hamburg. Nevertheless, despite the distance, she always maintained an intense correspondence with her father, who kept up with his daughter's joys and sorrows. Sophie had 2 boys, but a third seemingly unwanted pregnancy weakened her and paved the way for the virus that was sweeping across Europe to take hold of her. She died on 25 January 1920 at the age of 26. I'll try to not jump too much with the scrolling. Her death was a severe blow to the father of psychoanalysis, who came to recognize that although he had mentally prepared himself for the death of his sons, who had been drafted to the Great War, he was not prepared for his daughter to be snatched away. Losing a loved one is always painful, but losing them suddenly is even more so, because as Seneca said centuries before, what is quite unlooked for is more crushing in its effect, and unexpectedness adds to the weight of a disaster. Let me read that Seneca quote again. What is quite unlooked for is more crushing in its effect, and unexpectedness adds to the weight of a disaster. See, this author's excellent. She's kind of going between Freud's points and contextualizing it in a way that I just really appreciate. The unexpectedness is exactly what is dealing us the greatest blow in this crisis, what has left us with nothing to hold on to, with no cardinal directions to guide us. Many people have seen their relatives get sick quickly and leave them in a matter of hours. These unexpected deaths makes everything seem like a nightmare. We live through them with a sense of unreality that clears up at times when the pain breaks through. Sudden losses make it difficult for us to accept that the person is no longer with us. They make it even more difficult for us if such a thing were possible. No chance to say goodbye. This goes back to a quote. Although we've been worried about her for a couple of days, we've nevertheless been hopeful. It is so difficult to judge from a distance, and that distance had to remain distance. We were not able to travel immediately as we had intended after the first alarming news, because there were no trains, not even for an emergency. The clear brutality of our time is weighing heavily upon us. Tomorrow she will be cremated. Freud's words are very distinct. Freud's words are a very distant mirror but they perfectly reflect the pain of many people who saw their loved ones disappear behind the doors of an intensive care unit or an ambulance on its way to the hospital, and who are not given a chance to hug them or hold their hand again during their final moments. Not having a chance to say goodbye causes great anguish that in the long term can lead to feelings of guilt. We start blaming ourselves for what happened in an attempt to make sense of a sudden death that we find difficult to accept and understand, while the world around us becomes increasingly confusing, chaotic, and alienating. This is why Freud's story is also the story of those who had to accept something that until recently had become unthinkable, that someone could die without their loved ones by their side to accommodate them on their final journey, that their funeral would be brief, silent, and deserted, with only 3 people to fill the emotional vacuum and 10 minutes to say goodbye to an entire life. The fact that the coronavirus, just like the Spanish flu, can take not only our loved ones, but also something as essential as saying goodbye and supportive hugs, which we may receive too late or which will not be strong enough to break through the screams from behind which we try to send them. That's incredible writing. We must not forget that the funeral rituals fulfill very important psychological functions. It helps us to become aware of our loss so that we can start the mourning process. It gives us the chance to receive the love and support of others, to confirm that although we lost someone, we still have others by our side. And lastly, that's an awesome point. And lastly, it fills that deep-seated need to know that the body of the person we love has been treated and sent off with dignity. When both the person and the farewell rituals are taken away from us, we experience a double loss, double the pain, double the anger. See, it's interesting how she's, I forget the person's name, but I'll put it in the video. Incredible writer. This is incredible. Sewing together of these ideas. So how did Freud deal with the pain of losing his daughter? At first, Freud was devastated. He wrote to the husband of the deceased daughter that it was a senseless and brutal stroke of fate, stating that they could only bow their heads under the blow like the poor, helpless creatures we are, mere playthings for the higher powers. That's Freud saying that. His words give a glimpse of that initial period of mourning when we resist accepting the loss and feel immense anger because something extremely valuable that we would have always liked to have with us has been taken away from us. Freud too wavered between the need to accept a painful reality and the desire to reject it, precisely because it was too painful. Let's read that sentence again. Freud too wavered between the need to accept the painful reality and the desire to reject it, precisely because it was too painful. He took refuge in his work. His work was his salvation, and he acknowledged, I do as much work as I can, and I'm grateful for the distraction. As for mourning, that will no doubt come later. Freud, who had always been very attached to his routines, found in them a comfort and way to escape the pain that gripped him, even if only for a few hours a day. Finding comforting routines to keep our minds occupied will help us cope with the loss and give our unconscious time to process what's happened. Again, another great point. That's the author's point. It's no coincidence that it was during this period that Freud published the book that would mark a turning point in his theory. It's no coincidence that during this time period, Freud published the book that would mark a turning point in his theory, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It is likely that he took advantage of the chaos that surrounded him to reflect on the human essence, later manifesting in his work. The deaths from the Great War, the rampage of the Spanish flu in Vienna, and even the death of his own daughter must have left a very strong impression that led him to reconstruct the model of the psyche that he had proposed, and to which he made every effort to include Thanatos, or the death instinct. Some critics have said that this book was his most confusing work, albeit his most intimate. right? So his like most confusing, but also his most deep. In a way, writing about death seems to be a way of regaining control after the disrupting experience of death, of reassuring continuity in the face of discontinuity, of reassuring continuity in the face of discontinuity, of mastering the absence, suggested Elizabeth Bonfried. Freud found a way to channel those losses, the chaos and the suffering of the world around him, and that helped him move forward. From pain to acceptance. Little by little in time, acceptance also came. 9 years later, and this is the quote I'm using in the presentation, Freud sent a letter to Ludwig Binswanger, who was an early, he was a psychiatrist and an early person in existential psychology. That letter he wrote, my daughter who died would have been 36 today. So it said higher. I think that she died at 26, so 10 years after. So that's another layer of context for that quote, 10 years after. And this is a quote. We know that the acute sorrow we feel after such a loss will run its course, but also that we will remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what comes to take its place, even should it fill that place completely, it yet remains something else. And that is how it should be. It is the only way of perpetuating a love that we do not want to abandon. Freud always wore a tiny locket with a photo of his daughter inside it, and he looked at it every so often. Nothing could take her place. He knew it, and so do we. We know that the arrival of another person will never take the place of the one who left us, and that's the way it should be. But we should also be aware that mourning will be softened and transformed into nostalgia. With the passage of time, whenever we remember the person who's no longer there, their memory will no longer evoke the pain, but instead a bittersweet feeling that can even be comforting for us. Freud's story drive homes the fact that no matter how great the pain we feel today, acceptance and consolation will come in the end with reassurance of knowing that although a loved one may have been taken from us, nothing can take away the memories we've shared together. And that's what we must hang on to. Take care. So John Bowlby, who you'll remember from attachment studies, or from attachment theory, I meant to say, him and his student Mary Ainsworth. So Bowlby and other attachment theorists argue that intense grief reactions are likely to occur with the loss of any person to whom one is attached. Their theory predicts, and so attached in a kind of more general sense even there. Their theory predicts that the quality of attachment to the loved one should be related in some way to the experience of grief, and that the stronger the attachment between a mourner and a loved one, the deeper and more prolonged the grief response. And we talked about how there's like this original or initial shock and numbness. Like it doesn't feel real, and then there's just like this second stage of, and again, like obviously some people go through it differently, but he's saying that like there tends to, in his experience and as somebody that's spent a long time studying attachment, it seems that people in this situation go through this process of feeling a shock or numbness from the situation, and then feeling this like tremendous sense of an awareness of the loss that they're experiencing, and that being really disorienting and making them despair over this lost opportunities and lost ability to repair things with the person, maybe if it's, or a lost ability to like even just experience the person in positive ways. And then the fourth stage is this attempt to reorganize, or this attempt to try to put things back together as best as we can. So this is an idea that theoretically I completely agree with, and I talk with students about in kind of simpler terms all the time. And it's not like these terms are super complicated, but I don't refer to it as a dual process model, but maybe I should, because it's actually pretty clean language. But the underlying idea is that if people are going through something significant, one thing I always tell my students when I'm talking to them, if they're going through some kind of thing that's traumatic, but they're also like trying to make some meaningful change in their life maybe, but at the same time they're trying to also like do school and hold down a job and all this stuff, and that this is where this idea of a dual process model makes a ton of sense, that you can actually be focusing on both confrontation and restoration at the same time, that you can be putting time into, well, confronting the stuff that you're dealing with, but at the same time also starting to move forward. People in the process of grieving often alternate between those two. And that's okay, and it makes sense, right? Because just confronting whatever the issue is constantly, it's gonna burn you out. So you need some restoration, right? Or right, basically just this idea of like, it's just interesting to also think like what it means to restore, to store again, to like start to build back up. And especially if you're in a place of feeling emotionally lost, it's like, because of a significant life personal trauma, it's like kind of this idea of doing both things at the same time. You can't be focused on it all the time, but you're focused on it sometimes because it's had a huge effect on you. And you're trying to work through stuff and figure stuff out, and you have to sometimes confront and look straight at the thing you're dealing with. But then you sort of sometimes have to go and take care of yourself too. So here's two ideas that are both kind of difficult, and the next video is kind of a bit longer. If you're crunched for time, you can skip it, but I think it's pretty good. And the psychologist in it she's really good at, like, especially once you kind of get into the video, she really kind of explains this concept of complicated grief. And if it's new to you, I really recommend watching it. That people can have this prolonged period of grief, this complicated grief, often in situations where the relationship with the person was complicated. They may feel numb or detached, like they don't care, but they also are thinking about it all the time. Right? It may like really complicate their ability to see their own future, or to feel like life matters. Then another term that's really tough is this idea of disenfranchised grief, right? That like grief that's socially ambiguous, can't be openly mourned. It's like the classic example would be like two people that were in love, but they weren't allowed. It was a secret, and one person dies, and the other person's grief is about somebody that no one knows that they're in love with, right? That's obviously like a movie example, but that would be an example of this idea of disenfranchised grief, that it's like a socially ambiguous loss. Like to other people, it would be something that they would assume you wouldn't care about because you can't be open about it. Now again, that might be for all kinds of reasons, right? So this next video is on this idea of complicated grief.
Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about complicated grief and how it differs from regular grief. But before I jump into that, are you new to my channel? Welcome! I am a licensed therapist making mental health videos on Mondays and on Thursdays, so make sure you have your notifications turned on so that you don't miss out. But now let's hop into today's topic. And it's important, as always, I want to define things, so it's important to first know that grief itself is the natural reaction to loss. It's the body and mind's way of healing wounds caused by loss of something precious. We tend to think of it mostly as intense sorry, but it can present itself as a lot of different emotions or thoughts or even physical symptoms. The important thing to know about grief is that while it can feel awful, it is a healthy and adaptive process of healing. It's just your brain's way of making sense of the loss, and it helps us to learn what we value and leads us to reach out for comfort and relationship. So in a way, grief is really just a helpful tool for processing the loss. Now, complicated grief, on the other hand, can feel very similar to grief, but it is in fact very different from it. While grief is an adaptive process of making sense of a loss, complicated grief is actually a disruption of the grieving process. It keeps you from processing a loss. It's like a complete roadblock. Grief involves positive feelings and memories, and complicated grief generally makes it tough to be able to access the memory or loss in a way that enables you to have a positive or honoring feeling. Also, grief is a reaction to losing something you value. Complicated grief is a reaction to the negative thoughts or feelings that we have about some element of the loss. Almost like the loss stirred something up inside of us and it feels icky, and the thoughts that we have about it are all negative. That's where complicated grief comes out of. And overall, if that doesn't make sense, just know that complicated grief is really born out of a negative belief or experience that we've attached to the loss. It could be a negative belief that we have about ourselves, or possibly the relationship that we had with the person who's passed away or is no longer in our lives. Instead of processing the loss, complicated grief keeps us stuck in the process, unable to do the healing work of grieving. A better way of explaining this is if we talk about the loss like it's a physical wound. Grieving is the healthy process of that wound healing. It's the cleaning out of the wound through experiencing and processing the different losses associated with that wound. It feels painful at first. If you have a cut on your leg, you put rubbing alcohol or hydrogen peroxide on it and you're like, ooh, it really hurts. And then if we're processing it, it can get kind of confusing and it can be hard at times. But this whole grief process is necessary if we want the wound to heal fully. Does that kind of make sense? And complicated grief, on the other hand, is when that wound becomes infected, or you kind of keep tearing out the sutures. I love the band The Postal Service, and I just couldn't help myself, had to add that in. But anyways, during complicated grief, you are still feeling pain and confusion, but it's caused not by the wound itself, but by the infection that has gotten into the wound. For example, let's say you have suffered the loss of a person or relationship that is really important to you. The grieving process would be the emotions and the thoughts and the physical responses, they can often be uncomfortable, that come as your mind works to make sense of that loss. Complicated grief is the interruption of that process. So instead of being able to honor the person or thing that was lost, some narrative, like I was talking about, all those negative thoughts or beliefs we maybe have about ourselves, is going to distract and stop that. And so instead of the grief narratives, which are rooted in the loss and might sound like, why did this happen to me? Or I miss the way that they cared for me, or I don't want to do this without them. Instead, a complicated grief narrative might be something like, people who cry are babies, or this is all my fault. I deserved this. I'm so weak. Or even narratives caused by other losses in our life, like everyone is always leaving me, or this is always happening. Does that make sense? It's like instead of having a healthy thought and belief and story we tell ourselves about the grief, complicated grief prevents it and almost makes it personal, where we did something to cause it. And so, of course, we're not going to be able to process it and move forward. Now, as far as the emotions side, they may feel very similar, especially in the beginning. When you lose someone or you're grieving, you feel sad, angry, hopeless, maybe even depressed. But these emotions are not rooted in working through the loss, and over time, it'll become clear that you're just stuck in a cycle. You're responding to that maladaptive narrative you had, which maladaptive narrative is just like a therapist-y way of saying, that unhealthy story you keep telling yourself about the loss, like all those beliefs that we're having, right? So we can, respond to that rather than ever being able to respond to the actual loss we're facing, which is really why we can't process it. Does this all make sense? I hope so. So if we think this is happening to us, what could have caused it? Why would we have complicated grief versus regular grief? Now, there are a lot of things that can cause it. It could be, number one, and the most common, is unresolved past grief or trauma, especially from childhood. When you're a kid, sometimes you experience injuries that you don't yet have the language or cognition to even process. These things can be triggered or resurface when something happens in your life. And the second cause is loss you feel responsible for. Like you did something to cause this. Like I said, some of those maladaptive or negative thoughts that we can have can be like, people always leave me. This is all my fault. I did something. So that can obviously lead to complicated grief as well. And number three, it could be from invalidated loss. And invalidated loss occurs when you feel your grief is, disproportionate to the situation, meaning you really think you're overreacting and you're judging your grief instead of allowing yourself to feel it and validating the experience. And this could be because of the circumstances surrounding the loss, or the ways others react to your loss, or the culture in your family about grief. It can happen when you compare losses, or when certain emotions in the grief process feel off limits to you in your mind. For example, you feel guilty about anger, or have a belief system that makes you feel weak for really feeling sad and missing someone. And complicated grief can also occur when you find yourself in a situation involving delayed grief. So this is the fourth potential cause of complicated grief. And delayed grief is when circumstances make it difficult to process the loss as it happens. Maybe you're busy planning a funeral, or you have to care for someone else's experience of the same loss, so you aren't able to fully process your own. And I remember, honestly, when my dad passed away, my mom was sort of in this weird trance during the whole process, because she had to make sure that all the finances were in order, and she had to plan the funeral, and she was also consoling me and being there for other members of the family. And there was just so much to do that I think it almost just distracted her from her own loss. Another source might be ambiguous or hidden loss. Some losses are invisible, like losing a child to miscarriage. When loss isn't seen or acknowledged by others, you can end up experiencing complications. Or the sixth cause is compounded losses. When multiple losses occur around the same time, it can make it challenging to process each one. And number 7, sudden, lingering, or violent loss. Essentially, these kinds of injuries are often being experienced as what we would call a traumatic loss. Recurring losses, or losses that are disruption of some sort of essential belief or thought you have about yourself, can create trauma and, essentially, in the end, create complicated grief. Meaning that if the loss seems to go against what you feel you truly are, it could be as simple as always believing that you are strong and independent. But if our grief makes us feel weak and lost without someone, it goes against what we believe about ourselves. Do you know what I mean? And that can lead to complicated grief. Okay, enough about that and the causes. Let's move into how we can know if we're struggling with complicated grief. So identifying complicated grief can be tricky, because at times it can look very similar to regular grief. Not to mention that we don't just want to start thinking we have a mental illness when we're just doing something as normal and healthy as grieving. Now, since complicated grief is in the DSM, remember, it's not the end-all be-all, but it just gives us a way to better define and diagnose and treat certain mental illnesses. But in the DSM, it's called Persistent Complex Bereavement Disorder, or PCBD. And it's included in the DSM as a condition that needs further study, precisely because it is so complicated. And if you remember, I did a video a long time ago about non-suicidal self-injury, and that was in that same portion of the DSM, under conditions that need further research. And so what that means is that we might find it in the next update of the DSM. Now, in order for someone to struggle with PCBD, we must have experienced the death of a loved one at least 6 months previous, and at least one of the following symptoms has to be happening longer than expected, okay? So that has to be going on. And then we have to have at least one of these things, okay? And obviously, when we're assessing this, we have to take into consideration a person's social or cultural environment, because different people of religions and backgrounds and cultures have different grieving processes and what's considered, quote unquote, normal. Okay, but they have to have at least one of these. Number 1, intense and persistent yearning for the deceased. Number 2, frequent preoccupation with the deceased. 3, intense feelings of emptiness or loneliness. 4, recurrent thoughts that life is meaningless or unfair without the deceased. And 5, a frequent urge to join the deceased in death. And in conjunction with those, we also have to have at least 2 of the following. And these must have been occurring and been recorded for at least 1 month, okay? And the first one is feeling shocked, stunned, or numb since a loved one's death. Number 2, feelings of disbelief or inability to accept the loss. Number 3, rumination about the circumstances or consequences of the death. Number 4, anger or bitterness about the death. Number 5, experiencing pain that the deceased suffered or hearing and seeing the deceased. Number 6, trouble trusting or caring about others. Number 7, intense reactions to memories or reminders of the deceased. And number 8, and finally, avoidance of the reminders of the deceased, or the opposite, where we'll seek out such reminders so we can feel closer to them. Now, in order to diagnose, symptoms would need to create substantial distress for the sufferer or impact significantly on areas of functioning and cannot be attributed to other causes. Just like all other diagnoses, in order for them to be a real issue, they have to impair our ability to function. I've talked about that a lot in all of my other DSM diagnoses videos. But also know that grieving can still involve complicated emotions that you may not like, but they are about the loss and not about you, and not about the grief itself. What I mean is, don't think it's complicated grief just because it's extremely painful and there are mixed emotions. Trust me, I feel like everything I've had to grieve, every person I've lost in my life, has created mixed emotions and it's been really uncomfortable. And these complications that we're talking about when it comes to complicated grief are the things that are keeping you from healing and grieving. So the question to consider is what you're experiencing helping you mourn the loss? Or is it keeping you from even thinking about the loss? And if you think you might be dealing with complicated grief, please reach out to a therapist or other mental health professional in your area. They can really help you figure out what's interrupting the grief process for you and help you move past it so you're able to process the grief you're feeling. And one type of therapy that's known to help with this is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. In CBT, your therapist will work with you to identify the narratives. Remember those faulty beliefs or guilt? Anyways, they'll help you identify the ones that are interrupting your grieving process. Then they will help you identify what these faulty beliefs are rooted in and either help you work through them or separating them out from the loss so that it can be processed separately. Because let's say it was a trauma that's causing your complicated grief, we'd want to process through that trauma first and then get into the grieving process. But overall, the important thing to know is that complicated grief is very, very common. And it can and will get better. So please reach out, because if it's left untreated, complicated grief can lead to other mental health issues that would need their own treatment, such as depression or anxiety. And finally, I want to just get into something that you can use today to help you begin this process. And one way to do that is to start working through past losses. I offer this up as an option because it can be easier to start with something you aren't currently struggling with. Just like when we go to process through trauma, we may start off with a smaller, less emotionally charged portion of that first. So take a few minutes and think through some of the losses you've experienced in your life. Do you feel like you've done all the work of working through those losses? If not, maybe carve out some time this week to journal through those losses and see what emotions or narratives, those nasty stories we tell ourselves about it, see what comes up for you. And remember to be compassionate about this process and ensure you're talking kindly to yourself as you work through it. Loss is really hard. So try to pay attention to the thoughts you have when you start thinking about your loss. Are these thoughts about the loss? Or are they things that might be about yourself and what's keeping you from actually facing the loss? Then take some time to think about the loss itself. What do you miss about that person? What do you feel about that loss? As you process, just try to notice any thoughts that arise when you think about the loss. Those can be clues to what may be preventing you from grieving fully. Even identifying these will help you make more space in the process for your loss and resolve the complications. I hope you found this video helpful. If you want to know more, you can check out the links below and let us know in the comments if you've ever experienced complicated grief. And if so, how did you know that's what it was? Or how did you work through it? Leave those in the comments below because you never know who you're going to help. And I will see you next time. Bye.
In virtually every culture, the immediate response to death is some kind of funeral rite. It's weird that I just said funeral rite, and the word there says ritual. It's interesting how those are kind of the same word. A death ritual, however, is only the first step in the process of grieving and the emotional response to death that may take months or years to complete. And again, this is something that, not just virtually every culture ever, since there are Homo sapiens, and even before, we think the Neanderthals buried their dead, and Homo erectus might have too. That's a story for a different day, my dear friends. At this point, I want to just take a second and just thank you for being such a great group of people. I don't know if it seems like overkill that I do it too much, but I don't know. I'm at a stage of life where I'm getting older, and I won't be doing this forever, and I just appreciate the time we're spending together, and I appreciate all of this, and thanks for being such an enjoyable group of people to interact with, and I mean that. Like, I hope the best for you, and if I can help with anything, let me know. And yeah, just a thank you. I have two last slides. This is slide 28 of 30. The last two are both videos, and I called them classic footage 1 and 2, and it's just two of my favorite psychologists is Viktor Frankl and then Carl Jung, talking about their ideas around death, and I would definitely recommend watching. But again, if you're pressed for time, I understand. All right, thank you for everything, and more coming soon. Cheers.
To get back to suffering and despair, sometimes it seems that some people seem to have a much heavier load than others. Do these people not feel after a while, can I still continue to take meaning?
You wouldn't believe it. It comes to mind that there is a specific statistical, strictly empirical study that was published a couple of years ago by two famous psychologists. And it turned out, by way of not only of statistics, but by test batteries, that people prone to death, who knew that they were dying soon, had a higher sense of meaning than normal populations. And if I tell you the story that the dean of the School of Nursing at the University of Texas, in the Texas Medical Center in Houston, a famous center, she wrote me of a case of a young girl, very young girl, about 17 years of age or so, who was paralyzed totally, also up to her neck, and could only, by use of a mouth stick, type letters. And Dean Stark, that nurse, told me within 3 lines, I remember this letter, she told me that that girl is reading newspapers day by day, watching television, and as soon as she comes across an individual in a tragic life situation, she types with the mouse stick on the typewriter letters offering them consolation and comfort. And she has some credibility, believe me. And she, the Dean Stark, says she's full of confidence. She has a strong sense of abundant meaning in her life, while others who cannot see meaning under the best conceivable of conditions take their lives because they are frustrated. They are caught in an existential vacuum, in a sense of meaninglessness and emptiness. I have described it in a book of mine as soon as in 55. Since that time, it has ever more been increasing worldwide. You find you are facing it not only in Western countries, you are facing it in the so-called third world, you are facing it in communist states, and communist psychiatrists also describe it in their literature. What Frankl tells us about this existential frustration is also observable in the communist countries.
So are you saying that in order to find meaning, it is necessary to experience suffering?
I wouldn't say it is necessary to experience suffering. What I say is just that meaning can be found under each and every condition in life, even under the worst conceivable conditions, provided that it is a situation you cannot change. Remember, I said this explicitly. That means, provided that the cause of your suffering cannot be removed. If you can remove the cause of a suffering, say in case of a cancer, by surgery, you have to undergo surgery. If you are suffering from a severe compulsive obsessive neurosis, you have to seek psychotherapeutic help. There are, within the realm of logotherapy, for instance, certain techniques that can be applied with much success, as has been evidenced not by logotherapists but by behaviorists. And finally, if you are confronted with sociological conditions that have caused your suffering, then you are called upon to change the situation, to remove the cause of your suffering by political action, for instance. But in this respect, I would like to make another additional statement by telling you something that I, a couple of weeks ago, have told my professors and students forming my audience at the Karl Marx University in Moscow. I was invited by the prorector to stay there for a month and to lecture there on my teachings, but I had only time for 2 days. And I told them, don't think that I came to you from the West in order to sell you any political opinions. No, I don't come as a politician, but I speak to you on a meta-political level. This means that I recognize only, on a worldwide scale, only 2 styles of politics, or 2 types of politicians. The one is he, the politician, who thinks that the end justifies the means, any means, while the second type remains fully aware that there are means that would desecrate even the most noble end. And they were applauding that and understanding. And so I don't come into any country with a preconceived political conviction. I'm not entitled to judge it, but I have the responsibility to accept any call wherever in the world to deliver a message, if any should be present, and to act as an MD, as a doctor of medicine, and as such I had to take the Hippocratic oath that compels me to try to offer a cure to each and every individual or also population, if they invite me to do so.
Dr. Franklin, I'm going to ask you now, as you know, this country is going through a very difficult time. We have an economic recession, people have become insolvent or without jobs, the political future is far from settled. Do you have a message for us, a message that could give us hope and meaning?
You see, the only message I can deliver is a principle that I have adopted. I have adopted, I well remember throughout the days I had to spend in Auschwitz. There is statistical evidence that my chance to survive Auschwitz, real statistical evidence, was 29 to 1. And I had the feeling that it was like that. And still, I applied the philosophy of Sir Karl Popper, whose nucleus means that you cannot prove any hypothesis. The only thing you can do is falsify it, show that it is not valid, that it is not tenable. and without knowing his philosophy, I only met him the first time a couple of years ago, I applied this theory inasmuch as I told myself, Victor, the chances are very, very low and small. Probably you will be sent to the gas chamber, and still there is nobody who can guarantee me and convince me with 100% certainty that I shall not survive but end in the gas chamber. As long as I have no guarantee that I will have to die within the next days, I continue behaving and acting as if I would spare this fate.
Dr. Frankel, thank you for...
I remember you said that death is psychologically just as important as birth, and like it, it's an integral part of life, but surely it can't be like birth if it's an end, can it?
Yes, if it's an end. And there we are not quite certain about this end. Because, you know, there are these peculiar faculties of the psyche, that it isn't entirely confined to space and time. You can have dreams or visions of the future. You can see round corners and such things. Only ignorance deny these facts. It's quite evident that they do exist and have existed always. Now these facts show that the psyche, in part at least, is not dependent upon these confinements. And then what? When the psyche is not under that obligation to live in time and space alone, and obviously it doesn't, then to that extent the psyche is not submitted to those laws. And that means a practical continuation of life, of a sort of psychical existence beyond time and space.
Do you yourself believe that death is probably the end, or do you believe that?
Well, I can't say. You see, the word belief is a difficult thing for me. I don't believe. I must have a reason for a certain hypothesis. Either I know a thing, and when I know it, I don't need to believe it. If I don't allow myself, for instance, to believe a thing just for the sake of believing it. I can't believe it. But when there are sufficient reasons for a certain hypothesis, I shall accept these reasons, naturally, and should say, we have to reckon with the possibility of so-and-so, you know.
Well, now, you told us that we should regard death as being a goal,
yes,
and that to shrink away from it is to evade life and
yes,
life purposes.
Yes.
What advice would you give to people in their later life to enable them to do this, when most of them must in fact believe that death is the end of everything?
Well, you see, I have treated many old people, and it's quite interesting to watch what the unconscious is doing with the fact that it is apparently threatened with a complete end. It disregards it. Life behaves as if it were going on. And so I think it is better for old people to live on, to look forward to the next day, as if he had to spend centuries. And then he lives properly. But when he is afraid, when he doesn't look forward, he looks back, he petrifies, he gets stiff and he dies before his time. But when he is living on, looking forward to the great adventure that is ahead, then he lives. And that is about what the unconscious is intending to do. Of course, it's quite obvious that we are all going to die, and this is the sad finale of everything. But nevertheless, there is something in us that doesn't believe it, apparently. But this is merely a fact, a psychological fact. Doesn't mean to me that it proves something. It is simply so. For instance, I may not know why we need salt, but we prefer to eat salt too, because you feel better. And so when you think in a certain way, you may feel considerably better. And I think if you think along the lines of nature, then you think properly.